Good day, everyone. Thank you for allowing me to speak on cancer clinical trials in Atlantic Canada Province. I apologize I can't be there to present in person, but hopefully I can give you an overview of clinical trials in Nova Scotia um, and how we're trying to improve things for patients. My name is Dr. Ravi RAMJEESINGH. I'm a medical oncologist here in Halifax. I'm also the medical director for our clinical trials unit. These are my disclosures. And so I'm going to define oncology clinical trials and their role in treatments of cancer patients, discuss the current landscape of oncology clinical trials in Nova Scotia, and also what are some of the hurdles in clinical trial growth. When we think about clinical trials, it's always been part of these research pillars in oncology. Historically, we look at it as cancer prevention, quality of care, precision medicine, and clinical trials. But the reality is clinical trials is the standard of care treatment option for patients. So what are clinical trials? Well, a clinical trial is a research study involving human participants that evaluates the safety and or effects of one or more interventions on health outcomes. These could include, but are not limited to, drugs, vaccines, radiopharmaceuticals, biologics, surgical procedures, devices, genetic therapies. It could be anything. And the data for clinical trials can be used to support the approval of the drugs for Canadians or to compare to different medicines and treatments. When we think about clinical trials, you hear the words, we have a phase 2 study or phase 1 study, but what does that actually mean? Well, before we even start talking about phases of study, usually there's been at least 10 years worth of work in explorative research and preclinical research to try to identify something that can be utilized for a clinical trial. Once they've identified something, molecule, drug, vaccine, whatever it is, it then proceeds to phase 1. And a phase 1 clinical trial is testing the intervention or medicine, is it safe in healthy volunteers? Small population of people, we're looking for a safe dose and what are the side effects. It usually takes about a year to run a phase 1 study. Phase 2 studies are now looking at a much larger group, and now we're trying to see how does the intervention work in the people with the condition you want to actually study. Again, look at the side effects and also looking at the safety. And that could be a couple years to run a phase 2 study. A phase 3 is a much larger study looking at a lot more patients and then looking again at that population who might have the condition you want to study and looking for side effects. And the phase 4 is then taking this study into the real world and looking at how it's worked. But you can see it could take a number of years before you even get a treatment or intervention to be available for patients in the real world. So why do we run clinical trials? Well, it helps determine whether a new treatment is going to be safe and effective and works better than what we have currently. It's to determine whether a new treatment has less harmful side effects than the standard treatment and to provide access to treatments patients may not have access to. When we think of a standard phase 3 clinical trial, usually we have a single cancer type and they're randomized to either treatment A or standard of care, and we have all these different outcomes we want to look at. This is kind of the historic of what phase 3 clinical trials are. Now we're starting to branch to something called the future clinical trials, which is either basket trials or umbrella trials. So a basket trial is multiple cancer types screening for a single biomarker and using one drug directly against a whole bunch of different cancers. Whereas an umbrella trial is you have a single cancer type and you look for a whole bunch of biomarkers and you have a whole bunch of drugs to test in that single cancer type. And this is really where clinical trials are going. So why do we do clinical trials in the first place? Well, we're trying to improve the outcomes. And so what I mean by that is, well, let's look at ovarian cancer, for example. If you look over time, the treatments for ovarian cancer have improved greatly, which has led to improvement in survival. We see this with the mortality decreasing between 1992 and 2008. And part of this is because we have better treatment options for patients. When we look at hepatocellular carcinoma, which is liver cancer, when you look over time, we are improving the survival with each new clinical trial, whereas before we would see patients only living 7-8 months with advanced hepatocellular carcinoma or HCC. Now they're living 2+ years. And this is primarily because we have better treatment options for our patients. Then we look at lung cancer drugs. Well, there's a phenomenal number of cancer drugs for lung cancer that have been approved over the years, and this has led to decrease the mortality, or at least it's partly helping to decrease the mortality for lung cancer. Early screening also helping as well. And so we are improving outcomes for patients by doing clinical trials. So what is the current clinical trial landscape in adult solid tumors in Nova Scotia? So when we look at interventional oncology clinical trials conduct in Nova Scotia, most, if not more than 90%, is run through Halifax, where we have a CRU, which is the Atlantic Clinical Cancer Research Unit, the Hematology Clinical Trials Unit, the Urology Clinical Trials Unit, Radiation Oncology Trials Unit, and the IWK, which also runs clinical trials. There are some clinical trials that are run through Sydney and Cape Breton as well. So I'm the medical director of a CRU, the Atlantic Clinical Cancer Research Unit, and this is a CRU. It's a large number of individuals who are all working towards bringing clinical trials to cancer patients in Nova Scotia. We're primarily focused on solid tumors, so we don't do hematological, we do not do pediatric, but we do things like radiation oncology trials, medical oncology trials, and surgical trials at a CRU. A CRU is not by itself. We also have to work with Research and Innovation Nova Scotia. We work with the finance for contracts, with business development and R&D. So there's a large group of individuals that have to come together in order to work on clinical trials. Just a snapshot of clinical trials at this juncture. There's 21 activated studies in a CRU, of which 18 are phase 3, 14 industry, and 27 studies are in startup. Now, you may be saying, well, that sounds like a lot of trials. And it is a lot of trials, but there's a reason why we have to open so many trials. Finding patients for trials and getting patients on trials can be difficult. If you don't have a large number of trials, you need a large number of patient population to pre-screen for those trials, and then determine are they eligible for those clinical trials. And then we have to ask the patient, do they want to enroll in the clinical trial? We have to provide the support, the education, in order for a patient to be on a study. And of course, does the patient want to be on the study? This translates to numbers where if you have the whole population of cancer patients and you look at, do we have trials? It's only about 40, just over 40%. There's a trial available for that patient population. Of that 44%, only about 2/3 of them might actually be eligible for that study in the first place, but then even a smaller percentage are actually going to enroll in the study, usually based on personal preferences or resources or other barriers. And so you can think from 100% of patients with cancer, we're only getting 8% patients on a clinical trial. That's a small proportion of patients that we have being able to get on the clinical trial. And so there's always different pathways for when we look at trial enrollment. You know, do we have the trial available? Do we have the patient eligibility for a trial? You know, do we have the physicians who can work with clinical trials and are willing to participate in clinical trials? And then what is the patient's attitude towards clinical trials as well? And in each step, you can actually have a patient go into a standard care and they're no longer a candidate for clinical trials. There are a fair number of barriers for oncology clinical trials, and I just want to take a moment to talk about those. So we know that fewer than 1 in 20 adult cancer patients are going to enroll in clinical trials. We do a little bit better in Canada, where we see about 14%, somewhat older data, but 14% of patients are going on clinical trials, which is more than what we see in their US counterparts. We know, based on some of the data, that if you offer patients clinical trials, they're very, very open to them, are inclined and willing to participate in them. We just don't have those clinical trials available. And what do I mean by that? There are factors affecting oncology clinical trial participations. The trial design has an exclusion criteria which limits certain patient populations. The trials are looking for a subset of a subset of a subset of patient population, so it makes it harder to find those patients for those studies. And there's a cost of biomarkers in order to identify the patients, which are not really available because they're not being covered by many institutions. And so if you don't have the biomarker, you can't tell them if they are a candidate for a study because you just don't know if they are. So when I look at factors affecting clinical trials, I think of it as the trial, the institution, and the patient. And so when I talk about institution, trial units are not covered by the government, by the institution. They're usually self-funded through the trials that come into the unit. In order to get funding, you have to get patients on the study. So you have to have the studies, you have to have the patients to get on the study. That will lead to the funding, but if you don't have the patients, then you don't have the funding. If you don't have the funding, then you can't pay for the personnel to run the studies. And so it's this circle of life that I like to call it for clinical trials. You need to have the trials, you need to have the patients in order to get the funding, get the personnel to keep things going. And so the funding has to be better than the trial operation plus the fees and the personnel. If it's under, then you're going to run into an issue. It is important to understand that trial budgets do have the same, what I call death by fees. There's a lot of cost to a lot of things to run a study, which a lot of times are not really covered in academic studies that are covered in industry studies. And you can see that it can add up very quickly, and studies that are underfunded can be very difficult to run. This is all important because we're in a situation now where we know investment in cancer research has been on decline for a number of years, and clinical research is really perceived as an add-on to treatment or standard of care as opposed to being standard of care. And because of this, most institutions prefer to have this as cost recovery. They don't want to be paying out to run things. They want to be able to have their costs recovered to keep things neutral. And we know now that most institutions are running into a situation where funding is an issue. And so many are starting to cut back in what they're doing, hiring or having hiring freezes, and so, because of budget shortfalls. And so they don't have the funding to be giving out to trials units. In fact, they're looking to bring the funding in. And so if a trial is not able to pay for itself, it probably won't be available in the institution. And so many larger institutions do have institutional funding, industry funding, and grant funding to help run these trial units, but smaller institutions usually don't have institutional grant funding, and so they're relying on industry funding to help run these units in order to bring more trials to the population. It's also important to note that running a unit is very important to be done in a very tight regulated manner because not every center can get every study. Usually global company X will decide that Canada, you're going to get 4 to 5 sites that are going to be able to open trial Y. And so usually this trial will be open in Toronto, Montreal, and in BC, which leaves the rest of Canada fighting for those 1 and 2 sites that are available. And so if you're not running trials in a very succinct manner, it's going to be very difficult to compete with the rest of the trial units in order to bring trials to your province. We also know that you need to have more and more trials because even though you may have a ton of trials open, finding the patients based on their age, their diagnosis, the stage, how many treatments they had, their performance, as well as how willing they're going to be to travel and the types of therapies, it does mean a very small number of patients are going to be eligible and interested in those clinical trials. So before I took over as the medical director for our trial unit, I'm a very numbers-oriented person, and so I want to know how long did it take for us to activate a clinical trial? And unfortunately, the number was 16 months. So a year and a third. That's actually well beyond what the industry standard is to activate clinical trials, which is usually one between 6 to 8 months or less. You can imagine if you're activating a study in 16 months, well, as you remember from a slide before, a phase 2 study may run for only 1 or 2 years, phase 3 study 3 years. You're not going to have a long time to activate a study to find patients for the study. And so if you're only going to be open for a couple months, there's a good chance the uh, industry or the company or the academic site is not going to bring the study to your unit because it take too long to activate the study. And so once we identified this as being an issue, we then tried to figure out how do we improve things. And knowing that we can't get funding to improve this, we had to look internally to see how do you improve stuff. And so ways to do that is creating standard operating procedures, creating contracts, creating approval systems and meetings, increasing communication, hounding people, constantly reassessing the startup processes allowed us to improve things without reliant on external funding. To give you an example, we created these feasibility review forms for medical oncology. And so we would answer all these questions and determine, is this trial feasible in a timely fashion in Nova Scotia? We have study startup checklists, feasibility, site selection visit checklists. It sounds funny to create all these documents, but it really helps identify issues with the clinical trial, which may not allow it to be activated in your center, and then solidifies, can we actually do this study here? And of course, all this information we put into a database so that we can constantly look at the data, improve the things, identify here where the hiccups are, and what is the best way to get this done in a faster possible timeline. And so by doing all this, we were able to reduce the activation time in a 2-year period from 16 months to 5.5 months, which is below the industry standard. This is really critically important if you want to create a trial unit where you're able to run trials in a very succinct manner and have industry want to interact with you more. This allowed us to bring back industry into Nova Scotia, to have industry partners to run studies for patients, which meant patients now had access to things they may not have had access to or had access to it much earlier in the timeline than other places might be. I do want to take a moment to pat Cruz back on this because by doing this work, it allowed us to become a center where we were able to first activate a clinical trial globally. And this happened 6 times. So we were the first in the world to have a clinical trial. We were also the first in the world to have patients go on a couple clinical trials. So it means these patients were the first in the world to be exposed to a new potential life-saving treatment. We had 2 patients who were second in the world to enroll globally, and we were first to enroll in Canada 3 times. These are very important metrics, especially when we look at clinical trials, academic and industry, because if you're able to do things in a quick time fashion, you're able to get more patients on study. But even more important, you're giving the patients access to potential life-saving treatments earlier, faster than you would anywhere else in Canada or in the world. Another thing that we've been working on is this Atlantic Clinical Trials Network. And people will begin to hear more and more about this, and it's collaborating to compete globally. And this is bringing the 4 Atlantic provinces together. And the idea behind this is you have a one-stop shop where industry, academic, real-world evidence, these clinical trials can come to one place. They can create the one master contract, RB submission, budget, and training program, which allows a clinical trial to be activated in all 4 Atlantic provinces as opposed to one province or another province. Right now, each province interacts independently for active clinical trials. So the global company would then go to, say, let's New Brunswick first and activate the study, and then maybe go to Nova Scotia and activate the study. This is a way for the global company to go to one place to activate in all 4 provinces. It also allows for share services for places like PI, which do not have a robust clinical trial unit at the moment. And so the idea, now this is all in the infancy stage, is to eventually allow us to have clinical trials in all 4 provinces. And of course, that's important because that means less traveling. We also know that clinical trials are very much reliant on biomarkers. And so you have to be able to identify the biomarkers in patients to determine, are they a candidate for clinical trials? And so we have been partnering with the QE2 Foundation and the BMO Right for Cancer, which has allowed the Nova Scotia Health and the pathology lab to bring in new technology to allow for gene panel next generation sequencing to identify mutations in people's tumors that might open up other treatment options and might open up clinical trial opportunities for patients. And then last year, liquid biopsy technology was fundraised for as well, and this is coming soon. And this will be another mechanism of identifying patients for clinical trials. So by increasing the technology pool, we now have the ability to identify more patients for clinical trials. We also do a lot of education where we hold meetings both in GI breast clinical trials as well as hepatobiliary cancers. And we actually just had our first annual Nova Scotia Oncology Research Day, which linked up a whole bunch of different groups, including pharmacy and nursing, radiology, surgery, hematology, as well as medical oncology and others, to come together to talk about the research that's going on in oncology in Nova Scotia. So education is a very key thing in order to maximize our understanding of what's coming down the pipelines for cancer patients and how do we get access to these things for our patients. There's a large group of people that come together. You know, we have the research units, the contracts, the RB physicians, pharmacy, chemo units, industry, foundation, public, the provincial health program, cancer programs, and others. So it's not just a crew, it's a whole gamut of other individuals that we have to come together. And this is why it takes a while to add a trial to get activated, because everyone has to get on the same page to get things going. I mentioned there are barriers, and one of the barriers we can talk about is patient barriers. It is clear that, you know, the demands of a study can block a patient from coming onto a study. You know, their preference for a particular treatment, concern about side effects, how comfortable they are with the physician, language, loss of privacy. These are all play a role and can be barriers for patients. But it's also important to talk about race and ethnicity because they can also be barriers for clinical trials. When you look at in 2020, the FDA, when they approved 53 novel drugs, 75% of the patient trial population was comprised of the white population. You can see the breakdown from the other ethnicities. It's not very representative of the real world. And so we need to be able to get more representation in our clinical trials. A great study by one of our colleagues out in BC looked at the composition of race enrollment in trial reporting. And when you look at the 70,000 patients that have been on clinical trials, 53,000 of them were white, 10,000 Asian, only 1,500 were Black, and even less were Hispanic or Native American. So we're really not matching what's going on in the real world. It's a very select population that's participating in clinical trials. And we've known this has been an issue for a number of years, and you would think that we would be able to improve this over time, but we haven't. It has been pretty stagnant for this whole time frame. And so we do know that trust plays a role in the poor recruitment in clinical trials. When you think about patients, discrimination is a barrier, and individuals report being discriminated while seeking health care. And also individuals avoid healthcare because they're due to the fear of discrimination as well. And so you have this in the background. If you're not able to come in for assessments and treatments, you're not necessarily going to be able to talk about clinical trials, let alone to look at enrollment for clinical trials. The other thing is important is Are the trial results applicable to you as the patient sitting in front of you? When we talk about BRCA1 and 2 mutation, well known to be involved in ovarian and breast cancer, we usually estimate the general population prevalence of these mutations at about 1 to 300, 1 in 500, based on a number of studies. Some of this is from what we call the Cancer Genome Atlas program. It was a landmark cancer genomic program that looked at 20,000 primary cancers. But the problem is there's very little information on minorities or differential racial ethnicity groups. And when you look at 10 tumor types that were studied, which is 5,730 samples, 77% of them were white. Only 12% were black, 3% were Asian, and even less you're Hispanic or Native Hawaiian or American Indian. So you have a patient in front of you, but the question becomes, is what you hear or read in the literature applicable to the patient in front of you? And you don't know because they weren't part of that cohort when they did the analysis. And so it means we need to enrich things to have more minorities in these population analyses so that we can say, yes, I actually think the rate is 1 in 300 in the person in front of you. We have to acknowledge there's an economic burden for cancer patients, both the average costs for drugs and out-of-pocket costs. There's a psychosocial cost as well, and also, there is the cost to the family as well. Clinical trials usually help with some of this cost, which is why it's good to get patients on clinical trials, because it then reduces some of the costs that are incurred on patients. So how do we improve things? It's going to take resources, time, and money in order to improve stuff in clinical trials for patients. But how do we do this? Well, we try to give you the power. And so one way in Nova Scotia we're doing this is create a program called Nova Studies Connect, which lists all clinical trials that are active in Nova Scotia. And patients and their family can search it and identify potential clinical trials that are actively running in the province so that they can say, hey, I want to know more about this clinical trial. Send a message by clicking on the link, and the trial unit will get in contact. And so we're putting a little more power into the patient's hands to allow for access for clinical trials. It's also important to note that clinical trials are run primarily through Halifax, but there's a large distance to travel between Yarmouth and Sydney to Halifax. And it's not the best for patients to have to travel all this time just to be accessed to clinical trials. It's important to note also, we have a large number of satellite centers in Nova Scotia that we can have patients attend. And so really what we need to do is decentralize clinical trials, have the trials be done in all these satellite centers, and then just have the data flowing into Halifax that we can then send to the sponsors. And this is where we want to be in the future. And the future is going to happen hopefully soon, where we can run clinical trials for patients in those centers. So we know there's a bunch of barriers to clinical trials, and we know there's solutions. We just have to work on them, and we need the resources in order to do this. So just to summarize, oncology clinical trials are important treatment options for patients. The data has solidified in accrue, and we're in a position of growth. There are many opportunities to bring cutting-edge treatments to cancer patients, and there are multifactorial barriers that exist, which are slowing down growth in oncology trials in Nova Scotia, and it parallels in Atlantic Canada as well. So I thank you very much, and again, I apologize I can't be there to answer your questions, but you can also find me on X or Twitter or Blue Sky, and you can send me questions. Thank you very much.